Hi everyone, welcome to module number 4. We are going to be talking about the personality theories known as psychodynamics. Psychodynamics is a big umbrella term, and within that, there's three major schools of personality theories within psychodynamics. We have psychoanalysis, which this video is going to talk about today. We also have analytic psychology, also known as Jungian, and we also have individual psychology, also known as Adlerian. So again, this is going to be the video for psychoanalysis. And really, there's so much information in this module because these theories are highly complex and they cover a lot of ground. So really, psychoanalysis started to come on the scene in the late 1800s. So we've had over 100 years, at least, of these theories, and there's been many different contributors who have given to this. So let me share the slide and we shall begin. Okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So let me go to presentation view. For whatever reason, my computer is acting very slow. Okay, here we go. So psychoanalysis, also you'll hear as Freudian because psychoanalysis is based off Sigmund Freud's kind of writings and teachings. So as I mentioned before, we're going to cover a lot of information and it can feel overwhelming at times. Unfortunately, with this model, it is rather complicated, confusing, and weird. As you can see from one of the videos I have, what they asked the question, is psychoanalysis weird? For sure. To give some context of why that is these theories of personalities were developed by really people working with clients in a clinical setting and then coming up with an idea afterwards of what makes people tick, what makes people act the way they do. So again, these modules are our first clinical theories that we're really going to be diving into. And clinical theories have a why someone acts this way. So how was the personality developed? The reasons for that personality, what maintains that current personality, so what reinforces it, and also what ways can a personality grow and develop. So to give some context with the psychodynamics was how it worked. The original model of classic psychoanalysis was you would meet with someone like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, etc., etc. You would meet with these individuals anywhere from 3 to 5 times a week, 1 hour each session. And how it used to be was you would lay on that classical looking couch, say whatever is on your mind, and then the therapist would sit behind you and kind of keep track of what you've been saying, even what you haven't been saying, and then provide some interpretations with that. So why this stuff is bizarre and weird and usually has a darker view of human beings, a very sexual view, a very violent view, especially with psychoanalysis, is when you let someone talk, whatever is the top of their mind, especially multiple hours a week, human beings, we have a very interesting internal world, and there's some themes that will come up. So in other words, think of your own life. Think of times hanging out with friends or family members or someone you feel comfortable with, and just think of the topics that comes up in conversation, especially conversation that you've been having for a few hours. There's probably going to be some weird, bizarre stuff that comes up. And so with that, again, that's how these models were developed. It took the weird, bizarre stuff that people talked about freely and then tried to come up with the reason or idea of like, to make sense of this really kind of disconnected elements. So hopefully that gives some sort of understanding of really how this theory was conceptualized and developed. So with that, let's move on. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have two major terms going on right now, and they sound similar, but they're different. And really, we have psychoanalysis. And so That's a specific form of therapy and philosophy. So it's a psychotherapeutic and philosophical system of human behavior, so how humans act, behave, feel, promoted by Sigmund Freud and his followers. So his followers we'll call, very common term is what we call post-Freudian. So inspired by Freud, and there has been a plethora of them. If you go deeper in this topic, you'll come across Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. She was a big pioneer of defenses and working with children. You have Melanie Klein, who created another school called Object Relations. You have Winnicott, you have Lacan, you, you have beyond, the list goes on and on. You have Eric Erikson, you have Eric Fromm. I mean, there's Karen Horney. There's numerous individuals who have taken these original ideas from Freud and expanded them quite a bit. So psychodynamics is kind of a large umbrella term for psychotherapeutic and philosophical systems that views much of human behavior stemming from unconscious processes, so stuff we're not aware of, and internal conflicts stemming from the chaotic interaction between our internal selves and external forces. So to sum that up, really, psychodynamics is a large collection of personality theories that view a strong portion of our personality stemming from stuff that's outside of our awareness. And usually it has to deal with some sort of conflict that personality is a result of different forces or drives trying to get their needs or purposes met. So that could be how, let's say internally, I am an introvert, but externally, the society I am provides more extroversion, and that's going to cause a conflict. And then, because of that stress, that anxiety, and conflict, my personality is going to have to adapt that way. So maybe that could explain why in certain elements I'm more extroverted, but in those moments I may have higher rate feeling of anxiety, and then I have reduced anxiety when I'm being introverted. So that's kind of this idea. So with psychodynamics, again, we have the Freudians, the psychoanalysts, we have the Jungians, which we'll talk about as well in another video with different points of slides, as well as Adlerians. There's also many different other elements that we're not going to talk about. For example, the self-psychologist or the transpersonal psychologist, as well as even the relational psychodynamic portions. There's even feminist psychodynamics. There is large communities that we don't have time to even give due attention to or adequate attention to. So if we break down these words a little more, psychoanalysis can be translated to be defined as a study, exploration of the mind and the soul, aka psyche. And I'm going to talk about the psyche in a few slides from now. And then psychodynamics literally means the movement of the mind, soul, and psyche. So it's how our internal world reacts with external stimuli and vice versa. So those are just the definition of terms. And I'm going to use them interchangeably, especially in this slide, because they do kind of have similar components with it. So think of as psychoanalysis, if we're talking about geography, psychoanalysis would be a state in the United States, where psychodynamics would be the United States. It's the larger, more macro component to it, and there's different regions that have different properties and views of personality, but they're still connected in a larger umbrella. So with that, these are key themes for psychoanalysis, so Freudian elements. And again, these are going to overlap in different capacities when we're talking about analytical psychology and individual psychology. So key themes. The biggest portion of this module is that personality is greatly influenced from past events. So our development is highly going to play a role into how we interact with others. So psychoanalysis, as we'll see, is really key in our own childhood and how relationships, particularly between our caregivers, really is going to create patterns of how we interact with others, how we view ourselves, and how our behaviors are developed stems from our early upbringing. Now, when we get into Jungian psychology, you'll see that yes, the past is significant, and also the culture we're in and the history of the culture, the history of the human race is going to play a role into how our personality is expressed. And then with Adler, he kind of looked bigger, and not only just with our caregivers, but our family system and how our family system, especially siblings, and what role we are with our siblings impacts our personality. So we're going to cover more of those when we get to those specific elements, but that's the big theme for psychodynamics is your personality is greatly influenced from past events. The other element of this is all behavior that someone engages in is meaningful. So even classic Freudian ideas, we have Freudian slips, where slips of the tongues or mistaken words have significant meaning and represent something deeper about someone's mental state. So the old joke is um, Freud would say the Freudian slip is defined as you say one thing but you mean your mother. Okay, so it's something, this accident is more intentional than we think it means. So all behavior has some sort of purpose. um, so in addition to that, behavior, even negative, can have positive benefits, i.e. secondary gains. So to kind of take a sidestep, why that's important is if we take a larger view, psychodynamics and psychoanalysis in particular, there's a lot of criticism to psychoanalysis. And some of you are going to agree more with psychoanalysis, others right away, like, nope, a lot of this stuff is BS. That is understandable, and I respect that. Like, there's a lot of elements that are hard to disprove, and there's a lot of criticism and biases towards it. But the reason why psychoanalysis still pertains to this day is that it gives us a different perspective and helps us understand why people engage in behaviors that seem to have no benefits to that why people engage in destructive behaviors is because even though that behavior is destructive, there's some sort of benefit to them. So that could be someone being in a relationship that seems unhealthy on the outside. There could be a secondary gain where if they're in a relationship that's unhealthy, the motivation could be, all right, if I can fix this relationship, then I'm going to feel better about myself. So that could be the motivation why someone's still in there. On the outside, it makes no sense, but there may be some unconscious motivations that's occurring. Secondary gains we can see a lot in a clinical setting of we're talking about eating disorders. There's definitely some psychological secondary gains between whether we have body dysmorphia, anorexia nervosa, even some substance abuse disorders. There is some sort of benefit for this behavior. So, and again, we see this, we can use this lens to even look at mood disorders or anxiety. So no doubt when someone's clinically depressed, they're don't they're typically not choosing to be that way. No one really wants, most people don't want to feel clinically depressed, and it no doubt has a lot of consequences to that. And yet, some cases, why depression occurs is because prior to that depressive state, someone was experiencing a lot of intense emotions, whether it be anxiety, fear, grief, loss. Depression comes in using this model to numb those feelings. So those feelings of being numb have a secondary gain. Depression would have a secondary gain. So personality when we look at traits, especially traits that may be not as beneficial as we think, there may be some sort of benefit to that. So another example that comes to mind is conversion disorder. Conversion disorder can be defined. I'm not going to get into it. We're going to pause there. It's going to go down a rabbit hole. So I apologize for that tease. But the big thing is with this model, a lot of behavior, even if it looks negative, has positive benefits to the individual. Again, we call those secondary gains. So another component of this, humans are highly irrational, symbolic, and the most of the times unaware of the motives to their behavior. So we're not rational beings. We make decisions a lot of time that out of our awareness. We're more emotionally driven than most of us would like to admit. And symbols and myths have huge impact on our personality development. And we'll cover more about that with Jungian. From a Freudian view, dreams and fantasies are huge in making you who you are. And there's going to be a slide about that in the future of this presentation. So another part is our mind, psyches, or our psyche, tries to protect us from insecurities and anxieties through the use of psychological factors. So that's defense mechanisms, coping styles. So no doubt the world is stressful and chaotic, and that can have greatly negative impacts of how we're handling ourselves. And so defenses were going to come into play to not only deal with the stresses of the world, but deal with internal stressors within us. So with that, we're going to talk more about this throughout this slide and throughout this module. But from psychodynamics, and it started off with psychoanalysis, is within our personality, there are separate parts. So you'll even hear this in our own vernacular, our own English language, when someone has a decision to make, you'll sometimes hear them say, well, a part of me wants to do this and a part of me wants to do that, right? So we can even talk in parts. And that's this idea that we can have different parts of ourselves that are in conflict, and that can cause stress and anxiety. So personality change, because again, we're using a clinical model, so there's going to be an idea of how personality grows and develops, is going to change through a better understanding of the why we act a certain way, through exploring unexpressed emotions, thoughts, and fantasies. So again, from psychoanalysis, Freud was really big, and a lot of his followers were, that who you are today greatly stems from your childhood. And what happens in childhood, there's a lot of unexpressed needs. There may even be some trauma. There may even be thoughts that scared the crap out of you when you had them, and so you had to repress them. So those are defenses that we experience. A lot of what happens to us as a kid, we no longer remember, or we try to adapt it to make it more noticeable or easier to digest. So childhood is crazy in a way, and because of that, we're going to develop personality patterns that can be rigid. And so in a way, in order to change those patterns, we need to go back into the past, explore the emotions that weren't met, find the needs that weren't met, and even digest, or what we call metabolize, fantasies that were expressed but were experienced but never expressed. So the difference between experienced and expressed is experience from a psychoanalytic view means you have it in the moment, but you don't take some sort of action. So it's like we have this with emotions, right? We may feel an emotion, but then we quickly try to depress it. So when we do that, though, it just makes that want to be expressed more. There's an old saying that I use quite a bit in my own when I'm working with individuals in counseling, is this analogy of, have you ever tried to hold in a laugh? And if you have, what happens? Typically, it comes out stronger than it would be if you let the laugh out. So that's this idea of we need to allow it to be expressed, to let the action come through. Okay, so what is the psyche? Well, really, we don't know because with all of these theories, we're dealing with the internal world and we can't necessarily see it. So we have to create metaphors and analogies to try to make sense of what's happening internally. Again, if we go back to how psychoanalysis in its early days, we're listening to someone talk about what's ever on their mind. We can't see what's going on in their mind. We can only hear what they're saying. And so then we have to create analogies and metaphors for what's happening internally. So there's different definitions of psyche in psychodynamics in general. It could be described as our soul. So when we get into Jungian, the Jungians or the analytic psychologists, the soul can be really is a real thing, as we'll get into, is where Freud was influenced by kind of early biology and Darwinism of the late 1800s, where he viewed psychoanalysis stemming more from biology because it's about sex and drives and kind of animalistic qualities, where Jung based off his model against spirituality, mysticism, occult ideas, and alchemy. And so the soul, from a Jungian view, is very connected to the psyche, and that's where the original term in Greek comes from. It could be viewed as the totality of our mind, and that's a big Freudian view, where Freud describes the psyche, and I have a slide on this as well, as that classic metaphor of the iceberg. So the iceberg model of the psyche is we have an ego, and below that is different parts. And so looking at the mind as a whole is how we would describe the psyche. All the parts within us that have some sort of influence on our personality. That's very Freudian, aka psychoanalytic. And it could also be consciousness being sentient. And when we get to Adler didn't really have a major model of how the mind worked. A simple Adlerian view or individual psychology view is anything that is outside of your awareness is unconscious. But basically, his view of the psyche was what it meant to be alive, be conscious, be sentient. We have the ability to reflect on ourselves. So for a long time, and again, these models are old. They started to be developed in the late 1800s and really flourished in the early 1900s and still exist today. But historically, it was this core element that the psyche is what distinguishes us from humans and other animals. It's what makes us distinctly human. So, whatever the psyche truly is, it is seen as containing elements of ourselves that are hidden or not fully expressed. So we could even view this as a almost like a situationist element where depending excuse me on the situation is different parts of us may be expressed. The psyche has more influence on our behavior than we'll ever fully realize. That's the big element of these models. So again, personality is going to grow and develop by exploring one's psyche. We're going to learn more about ourselves, gain more control over our behavior, and grow as a person. So increased awareness means we're going to have more choice of how we behave and interact. And that idea of increased awareness is not unique to psychoanalysis. In clinical theories, we also see that as a big motivation of Gestalt. We're not going to cover Gestalt in this class. If you take theories of counseling and psychotherapy, you will. In addition, what we have in those familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, the third wave of CBT is the more mindfulness, awareness-based cognitive therapies. So you may have heard of mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness CBT, dialectical or dialectic behavior therapy has a strong awareness mindfulness component with it as well. So anyway, back to the model, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but this is Freud's classic view of our mind. So we have an ego, that's something awareness. So we have a consciousness, whatever we're thinking and experiencing right now. We have pre-conscious material, so stuff that's just below the surface. So that could be something that's out of your awareness until there's some sort of reminder, trigger, maybe a certain smell, Cookies remind you of, your grandparents, or maybe someone says, "Hey, you remember so and so?" And then boom, a flush of memories come to you. It also could be pre-consciousness, could be experienced through altered states, like I talked about before. Whether that be through hypnosis or meditation, we can access different levels of our psyche. And finally, the largest portion of this photo or model is that the unconscious element um, is greatly the most significant part of our personality structure. So, as you'll see, and we have biological components that are in the id, Eros and Thanatos, which we'll talk about. We have the superego, which is we'll get into, and that contains this idea of conscience, like our conscience, not conscience, consciousness, conscience, and the ego ideal of how we're supposed to be. And then we have ego, which is the reality principle of how we make sense of the world and has our defense mechanisms. Okay, so id. For a quick way to remember what the id represents is I for instincts. So the id, that is our biological drives. And essentially the id, it's present in early infants who are still building the concept of themselves, others, in reality. So really it's something we're born with, and the motivation of the id, because it was all about drives. It's very drive specific focus, that there are things within our just genetics and biology that are gonna motivate us to be a certain way, and that is usually coming from the id. And the main goal of the id is to keep you to survive. And a lot of survival from this model is seen as getting some sort of instant gratification. So you have a bodily sensation of whether being hungry or any other primal need, and then it wants to be satisfied at that moment. So the id is focused primarily on the me. So that's taking care of me, feed me, hold me, etc. So from Freud's view, Freud was not a big fan of children. If you read any of his own writings in biology, he felt children were very, especially infants, were really kind of antisocial, very focused on themselves, and that they only believed they exist to themselves. Now, other models, especially post-Freud, when we get into Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Karen Horney, and Winnicott, basically everyone after him started to take a different view, especially when more infant observations and research was done, where that kind of idea of children, especially infants, are more pro-social than we have ever thought. So they know there's a moral beliefs, and so some great experiments where even at an early age, children tend to infants tend to respond happily and smile to when they see acts of careness or acts of giving. They do have some sort of sense of morality to them. Again, that's outside this class, but there's a lot of research on that, and that may be innate. But anyway, from Freudian view, the id is kind of negative and very selfish. But as we age, the id is going to become repressed, and we're going to lose awareness and control of these forces. But so it's going to, as an infant, our id is at the very tip of the iceberg. It is conscious. That's constantly on our mind. Being an infant, we're just worried about how do I get my needs met. Again, we don't know if it's true. We can't necessarily ask an infant that because they don't have the cognitive abilities to understand that question, but that's how Freud saw that. And as we age, the id is going to go from pre-conscious to the unconscious, but it still has some sort of impact on us. So it never goes away, and it's going to express itself because drives always have energy, always need to have some sort of motivation or expression. It's going to express itself, experience itself symbolically. So that could be dreams, fantasies, slips of the tongues, and even we can have moments where we get taken over by the impulse. And for example, that could be you have a moment where, you know what, I probably should be studying, or I probably should be doing my taxes, or I probably should be doing something adult thing to do, but screw it, I'm gonna binge Netflix and eat a tub of ice cream. In that moment, you would probably be your ego would have been too weak and your id took over. Okay, so again, there's going to be, depending on the type of psychoanalysis and whatever theorist we're talking about, there's going to be different debates between what develops next. So everyone can agree that the id comes first in human development. Some would argue that the ego comes next and then superego. For this slide, I kind of take the camp that the superego will develop next and then followed by the ego. Anyway, but the superego, because the infant is so focused on immediate gratification, the infant is going to start to realize that in order for me to survive, I have to make sure that the other people around me want me to survive. So that's going to be when the superego develops. This is not Freud's model. This is based off object relations, which is Melanie Klein's, who was a kind of contemporary of Freud. But that's the idea that, okay, in order for me to get fed, especially if an infant's being breastfed, I have to have, mommy be pleased. Like if she's mad at me, she's probably not going to feed me, and then, I could possibly die. So I have to make sure she's okay as well. And we also see the superego model develop, and this is more Freud's idea, where superego really comes into play when a child experienced toilet training. So again, id is for instincts, superego, S for society. It is the idea that there's a part of us that's aware of others and how we should behave. So if we really kind of break down toilet training from a psychoanalytic view, we have a biological impulse to go to the bathroom, the id, right? We have the sensation, we have that feeling that we have to go to the bathroom. And typically, infants just do it when they have that sensation. Animals typically do that as well. They have that sensation, boom, and then they relieve themselves. But society has standards and practices, rules and norms of when and where you can go to the bathroom. And so literally society is trying to control the body's instincts, so no doubt there's going to be conflicts. And then a lot is not uncommon for a lot of family drama and conflicts to occur during toilet training stages. We could see children start to regress in age. They may act out. There may be a lot of conflict in that too. It is such a major milestone that even in contemporary play therapy, so are working with children using counseling and other psychotherapeutic modalities, it is a pretty standard practice when working with children to ask the family how toilet training went, because that can give us a lot of information regarding neurodevelopment, psychosocial development, conflict with the family, and how that conflict was met. So really, that's the big element, is the superego is this part that really contains social norms and how we should be. And it has this ego ideal where how we should be as a person. And so they typically, the id and the superego are going to clash. So the superego also contains our conscience, right? That voice in our head that's telling us how to be and how to behave. And if we go back to the previous image of the iceberg, a part of consciousness contained the superego, and that was kind of that voice in our head that, like, you should be acting this way, you should be this, or by this time you should have accomplished this in your life, what's wrong with you. It can sometimes have a very critical voice in it. It can also have the sensation, hey, if what I'm doing is not right, that could be a superego element. So the conscious element of our superego is kind of like in Pinocchio's Jiminy Cricket, that little voice in our head that's telling us what we should and shouldn't do. So then we have the ego. And really, the ego is a sense of the self, who we are, and we're aware of. And the primary role is to make sense of everything that we experience. So what we experience internally, how we experience ourselves in relation to others, and how we experience the world in general. So the ego and is developed really when we have the conflicts between the id and the superego. And the ego is designed to mitigate the wants and needs between the between the superego, because the superego wants you to be your ego ideal. Superego wants you to be the perfect person. And then the id wants you to have all your needs met and be almost animalistic. Clearly, those are going to clash. So then the ego is trying to please those two elements, okay, mitigate that. The ego has two powerful roles. It's the reality principle, where it knows, okay, I can't be perfect and I also can't be feral, so I need to find a way to balance those elements. And it also uses defense mechanisms to keep the structure of who we are. Because again, clearly from this model, we have different parts. And the ego wants to keep everything together. It's like this rope being strand. Um, in times of stress, trauma, conflict, whatever those terms we want to use, our psyche starts to unravel. And the ego is going to do all it can to keep it going, to keep it connected. And then we're going to use defense mechanisms to kind of keep that string from prevent it from ripping apart. So that's called ego strength, the ability for the ego to deal with stress. Now, this is ego strength is how we respond to diversity, stress, anxiety, and traumatic events. And again, the meta theme of psychodynamics, which I didn't cover in this slide for themes, but it's going to come up a lot in Jungian, is for psychodynamics, the personality should be balanced because there's going to be a lot of extremes, right? So already we see this with the superego and the id. They're kind of the polar opposites. So the ego is trying to balance those two things. And really, when it comes to ego strength, we want to balance between too strong of an ego strength and too weak. We want the sweet spot. Because too strong of the ego strength is you're going to identify with yourself. And you have a tendency, if that's the case, to be almost kind of egocentric, self-centered, and the extreme version is highly narcissistic. So you don't necessarily really have your attention on other individuals. You're more focused on yourself. And that's kind of when the id could possibly identify and take over as well, because you're focused on me, immediate gratification. Too weak of an ego and everything unravels. The rope breaks. And that's when the unconscious just kind of floods and becomes conscious. It's too much. And so with that, that's an extreme version of that when the rope breaks. That's what we would, in this model, call psychosis. Psychosis is a very loaded term, but it could contain hallucinations, almost symptoms that are very seen in certain types of schizophrenia. Again, psychosis is an older term, but it's like, boom, they kind of lost into another reality. They're not really sure who they are anymore. In addition to that, a weak ego could permit someone to really be motivated to have groupthink. So we kind of see groupthink and conformity in certain ages of child development. Because again, psychoanalysis is very focused on how we develop as a person, especially early development. And what we see a lot in adolescence is from this model, that's when our self-esteem starts to develop, is during our adolescence. And if we don't have proper ego strength, it's easy for us to start getting lost in the crowd, to conform with others, to have our identity rather be ourselves, be with who we associate with. So again, that can be problematic as well. So we want the balance between those two extremes, because if we have too weak of an ego, the superego may come into play because our social group may be more important than our sense of self. So related to this, there's going to be personality traits and behaviors that are either going to strengthen the ego or they're going to weaken the ego. Again, this is connected to ego strength. So the fancy terms are ego-dystonic and ego-syntonic. Ego-dystonic is behaviors that go against the self. So when people are motivated to change their sense of personality, they're typically in an ego-dystonic state, meaning that their their behaviors, just how they're acting now, doesn't really make sense to them, not who they want to be. So you'll hear quite a bit, this is not me, something's wrong, I don't want to feel this way. For individuals who seek out counseling and therapy, majority of them are experiencing some sort of ego dystonia. Mood disorders are kind of fit that model. Again, most people who experience anxiety or depression, they don't necessarily like that, and so then they want to find a way to change. They're motivated to change. So on the other hand, we have ego-syntonic, which can strengthen the self, strengthen the behavior. So people who experiences behaviors that are ego-syntonic, they rarely want that to change. And so they're typically not going to change those behaviors unless they're forced to. So extreme versions of this, the classic model, and again, classic because there's a lot of criticism of it, but the classic model is a lot of personality disorders in the DSM are going to be defined as ego-syntonic. Narcissism, for example, is that typically they're not going to want to change who they are because it makes them feel good. So, for example, someone who experiences mania, mania feels awesome. And so, yes, other people may be like, hey, you need help. But for certain times when someone's feeling that, again, not everyone, but some people are like, no, this feels awesome. Why would I want this to go away? So there could be certain just personality traits that may bug us, especially for loved ones or peers. We may have friends, family members, partners who have certain characteristics that just annoy the crap out of us, but it may not annoy them because that behavior actually may be strengthening their sense of self. Okay, so again, Freud based his model off biology, so he was really focused on drives, especially drives that motivate human beings. And essentially, again, the model of psychoanalysis greatly developed even in Freud's lifetime. And as he got older, especially after the events of World War One, kind of talked about this idea that we have life drive and a death drive. So within us, there's going to be conflict between this life and this death drive. And it's like anything in psychodynamics as a whole, there's way more nuance than what seems to be on the surface. So Eros, or Eros, depending on how we want to pronounce it, and Thanatos. So Eros is life, Thanatos is death. So both drives exist within all of us, and they're going to be competing for expression. And so Eros is motivated by this idea of sense of consistency and personal legacy. So yes, there could be a drive for procreation, and that could be reproductive, but also this idea of procreation of ideas. So Freud had a lot of followers. His ideas are still being talked about today, hence this kind of PowerPoint. In that way, that is a strong Eros motivator. Some people are motivated to have a legacy even after they're dead. So that could be having a building named after them, or having children, or having some sort of positive impact, or maybe even a negative impact on society. In a larger scale, too, and Adler kind of jumped on this as well, which we'll talk about in the future, but the motivation to within us, for most of us, by the way, to keep the human race going is an Eros life drive. That's consistency. So just because when you're keeping the race going, that doesn't necessarily just mean procreation. That means doing things to help the planet, doing things to help others. Being pro-social is going to have a consistent legacy for human beings. That's a social cooperation element, which can greatly impact survival. So that's Eros. And Thanatos is more motivated from change and completion, right? So Thanatos could be aggression, because from this model, when someone experiences anger, something has irritated them enough that that the only way they feel they can stop that irritation is by being aggressive, using violence, acting out. Um, it could also be a sense of completion. So um, from this model, risky behavior, again, is going to have a secondary gain, where certain risky behaviors can make us feel more alive, or maybe even decrease feelings. It may even make us, have some sort of sense of purpose. There can be some sort of sense of change and some sort of sense of completion with that. So with that though, we need a complete cycle. And what happens with our personalities is a lot of times you may see that you're consistently repeating the same patterns over and over and over again. And that's what we call repetitive compulsion. And it's when the two drives are kind of entwined together, because you're engaging in this behavior. A good simple analogy is always relationships. So you may have had a really crappy relationship, and then you catch yourself dating the same type of person over and over again, right? Different people, but the same patterns. And so what it could be is that the reason why you keep getting engaged in these patterns is that unconsciously you are putting in yourself your situations to change them. Because if you can change those patterns, you're going to have some sort of sense of completion and some sort of strength. Yet you're not sure how to do that, because the unconscious material is still being repressed. The answer or awareness of those patterns are not fully expressed yet. So we need to find a way rather to embrace or untangle, because we have the consistency. You're still feeling stuck, even though there's also a part of you that wants change. So we have to find a way to express those needs somehow. So again, pathology is going to develop from too much expression. So if we have too much Eros, it could be problematic, and too much death drive can be problematic as well. Too little, it could be another issue, as well as an entanglement, right? So I talked about entanglement with repetitive compulsion. The extreme versions of entanglement is, especially when we study extreme deviant individuals, for example, mass murderers and serial killers, there is a very pathological entanglement between Eros and Thanatos, to the point where a lot of their violence is highly sexualized. And so that is too much of an entanglement that is causing their personality and their behavior to occur. So again, with all this, healthy balance is key. Okay, so defense mechanisms, right? So this is all still connected to ego. Ego is controlling, is going to use ways to keep our strain, our sense of self whole. And the ego is really good at this. So defense mechanisms, Sigmund Freud alluded to them in some capacity, but his daughter really grew these ideas, and she deserves the credit for this. So defense mechanisms, they serve a huge important role in keeping us functioning. Defense mechanisms are not necessarily bad. So we're going to need some sort of coping skill to keep our sense of self. So we all experience this in some level, because of the pandemic. Our world changed rather rapidly, and then in order to keep dealing with all those changes, we had to have some sort of defenses come into play. That could be denial, denying that everything's going on. It could be acting out, start doing behavior that was irritating others, but just a way for us to express our frustration, our anger. It could also be regression. We started to act like a certain age. So I know for me, the early stages of coronavirus, I got into like a weird angsty teenage mode where I listened to all the goth, emo music and punk music from high school, and that's just where I was at right now. So from a psychodynamic perspective, I regressed. I regressed to a different stage to kind of deal with this situation. Um, so really the strive again for defense mechanisms as our personality develops, we want a personality that is flexible, a personality that is not too rigid and is not too weak. So, too rigid defenses are going to leave us limited to the ability to respond to a challenging world. So, in times of chaos, if all we can do is deny, 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 clearly that's not going to always work out, especially in the long term. So, we want to have a different repertoire of defenses in order to deal with the changing world. So, again, if we don't have enough defenses, it's going to lead to a possible breakdown of who we are. So defenses should be developed over time. Again, Freud's model is very developmental. We have an immature versus mature defenses. So as I talked about, defenses was Anna Freud. This comes from Valiant, George, I believe, George Valiant um, developed this model of immature versus mature defenses. So immature is going to be strongly self-centric focused. So the ego is gonna be pretty strong and it's gonna entwine with the id. So it's gonna be me, focused on me. And it's gonna kind of reject the superego, reject the other, reject society. So in times of stress and uncomfortable feelings, it's gonna be easier to blame others or cause damage to the external world. So that could be literal, like acting out or punching something, right? Sublimation, punching something or causing chaos or causing destruction or just wanting to see the world burn is going to be an immature defense, right? And also, the external world is going to contain people. So I could project stuff out to other people. All my stress and chaos, I'm just going to kind of place it on you and blame you, right? So behavior that is too rigid is going to damage and destroy relationships, because if you're just focused on you and you're kind of using people as a psychic punching bag, other people are probably not going to want to spend time with you. So that's going to cause interpersonal issues. So examples again of immature defenses, we see a lot of this with children. Acting out is engaging in a behavior that's inappropriate for the situation with the purpose of gaining some sort of attention, right? So you hear the term acting out with children or teenagers. They're doing behavior that they know is not appropriate, but that's what's going to get them their needs met. They want to give the message that they're upset, that they're mad, they're even scared. There's some sort of feeling that they're experiencing that they don't like, and so they're going to kind of take that emotion and deal with it externally. All right, you now have to deal with this problem, that kind of idea. Passive aggressive, same with projection. I'm going to project my insecurities onto someone else. I'm going to deny them. Denial is also an immature defense. Denial is a fantastic defense, one of the strongest defenses. The one of the other really major defenses that I don't have on here, but as another immature defense, is disassociation, where, especially in a clinical setting, when someone experiences extreme stress or trauma, they're going to disassociate, means they're going to kind of check out from reality. Disassociation is a really powerful defense. It's also, from this model, especially psychoanalysis, one of the last major defenses our ego can use before there's no more defenses. It's like, all right, I'm throwing it. This is all I got, right? I'm going to go to the extreme to protect you, your psyche, to keep it whole, where we're just going to lose awareness right now. So now we have mature defenses, and this is how our personality is going to grow and develop. So we're going to have to add behaviors that are going to be social. So I don't have this in the slides, but this is where Erik Erikson's psychosocial development would come into play. So like the 8 stages of life, and whether we're going to be more altruistic, whether we're going to be, how we interact with others is going to be integrated to how while our defenses mature. So mature defenses are ones that take stress and anxiety and try to convert the energy into ways that promote social connections. So the ego has to be rather strong in this capacity, but not too strong that it shuts off other individuals. So it's not egocentric, and accepts the idea that others can be a source of assistance. And we're going to see this with secure attachment in the next few slides. But examples of this: in times of stress, it may feel good to just help others. Altruism. In times of stress, it may be good to have a good laugh about it. In addition to that, sublimation could be in times of stress, we're going to take that stress and we're going to do something procreative with that. So classically, let's say someone just had a horrible breakup, they're feeling sad, they're feeling blue, they're feeling down, lonely, all that. Well, they're going to write some music, right? Taylor Swift does sublimation all the time. A lot of artists do sublimation. I'm going to take these emotions and I'm going to do something creative with that. Or it could be, during times of the quarantine and pandemic, all right, I'm feeling anxious and stressed. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make sour bread, because I'm going to take that energy, I'm going to freaking pound the bread, roll it out, do all that stuff. That would be viewed as sublimation. Okay, so really, again, just another to iterate. The past is key in developing personality, right? That's a big message I want you to take away from this. But also know, especially psychoanalysis, a big criticism is we tend from this model to blame parents. A bad childhood, bad mother, bad father is the reason for our not so great traits. We're going to learn how to relate to ourselves and others from past relationships. So we also see this in sociology, where we don't learn our traits about ourselves, whether we're caring, whether we have a sense of humor, whether we're intelligent. We typically don't have those ideas until someone says them or shows us that, hey, you're this, you're that. And then we kind of grab onto those selves. So typically from psychoanalysis, if you have critical or positive elements from view of yourself, you may have learned that from someone else. So depending on our relationships with caregivers during our development will influence how we relate to ourselves and others as we grow older. Again, very similar, or Erickson would be greatly entwined into this of the social development stages. So another element of this is attachment theory, and attachment theory has its roots in psychoanalysis. So here's some attachment styles. And again, this is another major field of psychology. And depending on the theorist or time period, there may be different words used to explain the different styles. So the first one is secure, and this kind of taps into a balanced ego strength as well as positive use of mature defense mechanisms. But someone with a positive view of them, someone with a secure attachment is going to have a positive view of self and others. And we're also going to see, too, that Adler talked about these in different terminology. And I'm going to allude to them. We're also going to cover them more fully in the future video. So anyway, someone with a secure attachment is going to have this mindset of, I am comfortable depending on others, and I am comfortable on others depending on me. So I feel, there's not a lot of stress on having to ask for help, and there's not a lot of stress when others ask me to help them. So secure people typically are going to be in relationships with other secure people. They tend to bond together, not just romantically, but also in friendships. The next the next two are, you're going to see bond up quite a bit. And I'm going to talk about a relational pattern as well. So we have anxious preoccupied. So that's someone with a negative view of self and positive view of others. So this is going to be similar to an inferiority complex, which we'll talk about with Adler. So someone with an anxious preoccupied is, I am comfortable depending on others, but I'm not comfortable, but I'm not comfortable on others depending on me. So if someone expects help, they're going to feel anxious about it. And that anxiety is going to kind of make them feel insecure. So the missive avoidant is going to be a positive view of self and negative view of others. So others are undependable. So the only person I can depend upon is myself. So I'm going to focus on me rather than having to rely on you, because relying on you terrifies me. And finally, fearful avoidant is, or excuse me, before I get to fearful avoidant, what we do see in relationships is typically anxious, preoccupied, and dismissive avoidance tend to cluster together because they kind of play off each other. And I'm going to talk about that when we get to Karen Horney, how that dynamic plays into each other. Finally, we have fearful avoidant attachment styles. So this is a confused view of self and others. So I know I should trust others and trust myself, but I can't trust others nor trust myself. So again, attachment styles are influenced by temperament, which we talked about in biology, our social environment, as well as interactions and relationships. Their attachment styles can be modified. There's a lot of research for this. So just because we have our past influences our attachment style, in the future with the right relationships, we can change our attachment styles. Okay, so Karen Horney, as I've said her name quite a few times, she was a post-Freudian, so she kind of viewed different, she had a lot of critiques of Freud, especially regarding Freud's sexual theories. And so she focused more on there's a strong relational element that happens with psychoanalysis. So how we interact with others can be defined into three major categories. So we have the moving towards. So in times of stress, the moving towards have a need to be liked. And how they get that need met, or how they feel like they're going to be liked, is by pleasing others. So in times of conflict, they're going to put others before themselves. So we'll see this also in Adlerian, but here's me, and if I have a compliance type, here's others. Others are better than I am. So in times of stress, I'm going to put others before me. So that is, if we can go back a slide, that's similar to the anxious preoccupied, right? We have the inferiority complex going into it. The moving away is the need to be liked is viewed as almost impossible for the individual, is fearful they are flawed. So in times of stress, they're going to, because they're feared that, all right, I may be responsible, or I'm worried about getting hurt, or whatever it is, that I don't want to rely on someone else because I'm fearful of what that means. Maybe I'll lose my sense of self. Maybe I'm going to get crushed. Maybe I'm going to get hurt. Maybe I really can't rely on them. So you know what? In times of stress with relationships, rather than moving towards them, I'm going to move away. I'm going to withdraw. So as I mentioned, anxious, preoccupied, and the and the dismissive avoidant can pair up in times. And in couples work, we call this pattern pursuer withdraw. So in times of relational stress, someone who is compliant is going to take that stress and start to move towards the other person. So they're feeling insecure, and how they're going to need to deal with that insecurity is by making the other person feel good. So they're going to buy flowers, they're going to do everything they can to make that person feel special. But that person typically is going to feel uncomfortable with that, and they're going to start withdrawing because they're fearful of that. They're fearful of the commitment. They're fearful of letting that person down, because someone with the compliant view may be putting this person on a pedestal or expectations that really the withdrawal person doesn't feel like they can live up to. And they're like, screw that, I'm getting out of town. And that can create this cycle, this pattern. The more someone pursues, the more the other withdraws. The more the other withdraws, the more the other person pursues. So again, the withdrawer is they're fearful, the individual, they're fearful of something. So the individual tends to avoid any situation where the fear can be proven right. So they're just withdrawing. They may be communicating less with the other person. They may be giving mixed messages. They're just like kind of trapped in a relationship, but doing all they can to withdraw from it without necessarily leaving it. So then we have someone who moves against relationships, where they're going to, rather than kind of be nice and pleasing, they're going to strive to control the relationship. So they're what we call the aggressive type. So their need to be liked is by showing dominance, striving for power, striving for prestige, and striving for independence. They're going to want to control the situation. They're going to put self before others. So their ego, they're probably going to have too strong of an ego strength, and they're going to identify with it. As well, they probably have some sort of Thanatos or even Eros going in, whether they want the power and prestige because they want some sort of lineage, some sort of control, some sort of constance, or whether they want dominance because they want aggression, they want to destroy things, they want to complete things, they want to conquer things. So those kind of dynamics can play out. Finally, whew, okay, so as you can see, before I finish with this slide, there's a lot about how we interact with others. Is there's some sort of emotion connected with that, and typically that emotion is outside of our awareness, and that emotional pattern relates to whatever happened in our childhood. Okay, so with this, another major element of personality change from a psychoanalytic model is the integration of dreams, fantasies, and myths. So a lot of this, interestingly enough, like this is our first time really talking about dreams and fantasies, and even in a lot of psychology courses we don't talk about this, but this is a huge major element, or one of the major elements of us being human. And again, the reason why this is part of the model is because if you just listen to someone talk, there's going to be fantasies and dreams, whether waking dreams or even dreams at night, that occur that someone likes to talk about. So Freud was all about these things have some sort of wish fulfillment. So there's some sort of fulfillment we are striving for by having dreams and fantasies. There's something that we want to achieve, and we can't achieve that yet, so we're going to fantasize about it because that gives us some sort of feeling of something. So fantasies and imagination are an important part of being human, an important part of our personality. So with that, though, again, there's going to be internal conflicts between our internal fantasies and the external expectations. In Western culture, society mostly promotes a more voyeuristic view of fantasy fulfillment. Almost all our forms of entertainment is that idea. So I'm a big football fan. I no longer can play football because of, I just can't. I'm not talented enough. I had a football injury that kind of ended my career. I can't do that anymore. That was a big part of my life, but I can't play that anymore. But what do I do every Saturday and Sunday? I really get involved in watching football because there is a wish fulfillment that I am kind of living through those players. It's very voyeuristic, right? Just think about your own Facebook feed, your own Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, whatever you spend your time on consuming from entertainment wise, there may be some sort of fantasy or wish that you wish you were that way, or maybe there's a part of you that just can't be expressed, but you're getting that expression in some form through that entertainment. So the balance would be, because we're in a culture of mostly consuming things, that we need to find a balance for our personality to grow by promoting more active engagement, more active imagination with some of our fantasies. So what that could be is, if you're really into watching people talk about the stories they write, or always wanted to make something creatively, and you see yourself like you watch a lot of how-to videos, but you never actually do them. So then maybe it would be the step of, all right, I've watched all these cooking videos. Maybe I should actually start cooking. That kind of idea would make it more active. And no doubt that experience is going to help personality grow and develop. So some fantasies are maybe encouraged to become reality, right? So, like, be simple to encourage this idea of, all right, you've been watching a lot of cooking shows, maybe take one of those recipes and try it out. While other fantasies, it may be more beneficial, excuse me, for the individual to be kept in that symbolic frame. There's some fantasies, some dreams, some ideas that is going to be more problematic if we try to live out. So, really, this is a big element of role as counselors and therapists using psychoanalytic views. Um, because for the most part, this presentation was very sterile of all the sex and death and destructive elements that comes up in psychoanalytic ideas, philosophy, and even practice. But as that role, if we can know from our own dreams and own fantasies, there's some images that come to our heads that are very ego-dystonic. That like, why did I have that dream? That's terrifying. Or like, I really have this impulse that's coming from my id, but really that is a very antisocial thing to do. So I need good superego strength to kind of keep that idea engaged. So with that, psychoanalysts love the idea of horror movies because horror movies are all, especially slasher films, have a lot of themes about sex and death. And from their view, that it can be very cathartic. Cathartic is this idea in psychoanalysis where pent up emotions and expressions that have been unexpressed are allowed to come up in a positive way. So, catharsis is a simple idea that if it can feel good, after you talk about how you feel, it feels good. That was cathartic. Sometimes, if you're feeling some emotional pain, watching a sad, sappy movie, crying the whole time afterwards, you know what? That was worth it. That was cathartic. So, this idea that certain elements are going to have to play it out in a fantasy way can still be cathartic. So, we're coming to an end with this. I gave you a lot of information, and literally just know that I only scratched the surface, not even like a little indent of psychoanalytic thought. There's a lot there that we haven't gone into. Um, but really, it is okay at this moment, and it's expected to feel really overwhelmed and like these ideas don't make sense. And that is perfectly understandable because the one thing I want to really reiterate is that individuals who have mastered this model of personality and personality change have taken years of practice, training, and experience to really kind of understand this. So, for example, let's say you want to become a Freudian analyst. So that typically you have to have a degree. Sometimes it's already a doctorate, depending on the location, or at least a master's. So you're talking at least a minimum of 6 years of college. Then you apply to a training program. Even to apply, you need to have like 100 hours of your own therapy as a client just to apply. And then it can take anywhere from 4 to 6 years. That's just psychoanalyst. If we want to get Jungian takes like 8 years. And sometimes the schools don't let you in unless you're past a certain age. So, like, we'll get into Jungian later. But really, my point is that these ideas are really complex, and it's okay to not have a good understanding. And really, from my own experience, how I'm still learning these ideas. I'm not an expert on them at all, but these ideas started to really click the more I worked with individuals in a clinical setting. And once you kind of have this framework, it will start to click when you're watching movies, seeing other people interact, like, oh, now I'm kind of getting these ideas. Um, so that it's okay to, I don't expect you to be experts with this idea because it would be impossible, right? Experts have to go through multiple years of training, multiple years of their own therapy, and then multiple years of being supervised as providing therapy by another therapist. It takes many years to understand these ideas. So, for now, really just remember that it's all about understanding that someone's personality is greatly impacted from their past, and that how they're acting has typically can be outside of their awareness, And also they're behaving for a reason, most likely to get some sort of need that was not met in childhood. They're trying to get it out now as an adult. All right. So we're going to end there. And then remember, there's also the Jungian video and then Adlerian video. All right. Have a good day. And I'm going to end the video. Stop the sharing. And then end.